European capitals have grown far too accustomed to U.S. subsidized security for way too long. It's an imbalance that has allowed Europe to enjoy constant protection without bearing the risks or the costs. Today, as Washington hosts the annual NATO summit, we find ourselves at a crossroads. NATO, now turning 75, is an alliance with major issues. And despite the rhetoric from President Biden and his handlers, the simple truth is that we cannot afford to consider admitting Ukraine, nor should the United States be making overtures about future membership. As NATO gathers on our soil, the U.S. needs to be forthright with our allies that the U.S. cannot sustain the massive levels of support for Ukraine, and any discussion of Ukraine's membership cannot be on the table. We have challenges right on our front door that need our immediate attention. The crisis at our southern border, and the credibility, the credible military threat from China in our hemisphere and the Pacific. Those two things combined are things we've got to address, urgently so. The situation at hand demands that we prioritize our own borders and our own deterrence efforts in higher priority theaters. We simply do not have the luxury of infinite military resources, capabilities, or personnel. And we do no favors to our European allies by minimizing the painful reality that the U.S. must prioritize our own security needs. We need to be honest with our allies about the truth. The European security environment has drastically changed since the 2% defense spending pledge was made a decade ago at the 2014 Wales NATO summit. Our alliance's refusal to commit to raising this baseline to 3% or above, which is necessary to meet today's strategic demands, places a disproportionate burden on the American people. Our military and diplomatic leadership have admitted that 2% is insufficient. However, commitments to increasing defense spending have not been made at this year's summit. While European domestic budgets focus on massively funding free health care, shortened work weeks, social welfare programs, climate alarmism, and woke DEI activities, the U.S. still far exceeds the wealthiest European NATO allies in military contributions to Ukraine, as this graph demonstrates. While Americans are pinching pennies, we're sending our tax dollars to fight in a faraway war. The burden must shift to Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London. Instead of confronting reality, however, the Biden administration recently inked a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine, promising that, quote, Ukraine's future is in NATO, and asserts that there are no limits to U.S. aid. This is pure fantasy. To start, Ukraine does not meet NATO's membership standards, not even close, not by a mile. Our defense industrial base and dwindling stockpiles demonstrate that there are practical limits to what the U.S. can reasonably do for Ukraine. The agreement also leaves open the possibility that U.S. forces will be used to, quote, confront any future aggression against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Once again, sidestepping Congress and the American people to put us on a path to a direct shooting war with a nuclear-armed adversary. This, Madam President, is armchair brinksmanship by politicians whose children won't be the ones dying. The supposed purpose of NATO is to protect its members and prevent war, not bring us closer to it. Despite these obvious flaws, the Biden administration sought to make it deliberately difficult to terminate this proposed 10-year agreement. My resolution condemns this 10-year bilateral security agreement with Ukraine. It affirms that the agreement has no force of law without Senate ratification and rejects it as a bridge to Ukraine's NATO membership. The Biden administration cannot be allowed to skirt the Constitution, to relegate Congress to the periphery, or to tie the hands of future administrations to entertain the fantasies of Ukraine joining NATO. We must prioritize our national interests and uphold the principles and protections of our Constitution. It's time, Madam President, for Congress to remind the alliance and the Biden administration that we hold the power to make treaties, to extend NATO membership, and that overtures made to Ukraine and our European allies are not, quote unquote, irreversible. Ukraine's membership is not set in stone. If Ukraine is in, the U.S. should be out. And so, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration and that the Senate now proceed to Senate Resolution 748. I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Mississippi.
reserving the right to object, I would simply observe that this resolution is in fact not the sense of the Senate, and it is wrong to suggest that the Senate in any way, that a majority of senators in any way agree with this resolution. It is also a simple fact that the dictator, the war criminal, Vladimir Putin, thinks he can wait out the clock. This resolution closes the door, would close the door, to continued support for Ukraine. Taking bilateral agreements off the table would simply bind America's hands. Victory against the dictator Putin must be our position. Ukraine can't win without the support of its friends. Putin knows this, and surely, my friend, the senior senator from Utah also knows this. We should not pass this resolution because it would hand Putin a rhetorical victory, and we should not permit that. I yield the floor.
Is there objection?
Reserving.
Senator from Maryland.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President, it's interesting, earlier today, there was a large bipartisan group of senators that met with President Zelensky of Ukraine. We expressed our bipartisan support for the United States continuing to support Ukraine's efforts to repeal the outrageous attack to their sovereignty by Mr. Putin and Russia. It was a bipartisan support for Ukraine because we recognize that Ukraine is the front line in the defense of our democracy. Ukraine is not asking us for our soldiers, they're asking us for our support. So I want to start in my concerns of the unanimous consent request offered by the senator from Utah, that the support for the defense of Ukraine enjoys overwhelming bipartisan support here in the United States Senate. And that's why I was pleased to join Senator Wicker on the floor. When the supplemental funding bill came up for a vote, 79 senators, Republicans and Democrats alike, backed it. Why is that? It's because most senators understand what is at stake. It's because we understand that Ukraine is not only fighting for themselves, they are fighting for the entire Western world. It's because we understand that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, it will endanger our security interests and those of some of our closest European allies. Yes, they're asking for the financial and military support. Their success, Ukraine's success, will help make it possible for our soldiers not to be in another war in Europe. And so supporting Ukraine in this fight against one of the most dangerous adversaries in the world is clearly in the national security interests of the United States. I also want to address one of the arguments offered by my colleague from Utah. The idea that this executive agreement should have no effect unless submitted to the Senate for advice and consent. Multiple administrations have used executive agreements to advance diplomatic goals that are in the U.S. national security interest. Along with my colleagues, I support this bilateral agreement because it does just that. It advances Ukraine's interests and our own interests in national security. Unlike other administrations, in this case of this agreement, the Biden administration proactively reached out to members and staff in both chambers and both parties to share the parameters of the negotiations while they were underway. They solicited reactions and input from Congress, and they took some of our input in regards to the final negotiations. And unlike the practice of previous administrations, the Biden administration posted the text of the agreement on the State Department website the day it was signed. We in Congress were kept up to date on parallel negotiations with Ukraine's by 30 other nations. They're negotiating with 31 countries bilateral security agreements so that we can have a comprehensive help to Ukraine in its defense of democracy. Many are in NATO, but there are also other countries that the U.S. have rallied to support Ukraine. So far, Ukraine has signed 20 bilateral security deals. They include concrete provisions on long-term military and financial aid. They include training of Ukrainian troops. They include weapons delivery. And I want to be clear, they do not include deployment of foreign soldiers to fight in Ukraine. It is envisioned that 32 nations will enter into bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. While they will vary in some extent, they will create a robust commitment of support for Ukraine. It also adds to this argument, and specifically the United States bilateral with Ukraine, includes commitments by Ukraine to continue its consolidation of democratic governance and anti-corruption initiatives. It's absolutely critical we send a clear message to Vladimir Putin that no matter who's in the White House, the United States will stand by Ukraine in its fight to maintain its sovereignty. Finally, Mr. President, this is not charity. It serves our national security interests. It's because future wars will be different from the prior conflicts. They will now involve modern technology. Right now, Ukraine is experimenting with how to be effective in such a war, and Ukraine is adapting in real time. With this bilateral agreement, Ukraine will be sharing information with the United States on everything they are learning on the battlefield. They will give our soldiers and military planners the ability to develop creative ways to use these new technologies. This agreement strengthens our national security. It strengthens Ukraine, and it strengthens the resolve of allies looking to the United States for leadership on the global stage. For all these reasons, I object to the unanimous consent request.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I appreciate the insights offered by my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Maryland. I'm grateful for his leadership in the Senate, for his friendship and all he does in looking out for the interests of our country. And I'm grateful to have his insights today on the floor, explaining the reasons for his objection to the resolution that I've offered. But I'd like to note that not one of these arguments negates the fundamental realities that we're dealing with here. Not one of them negates something very fundamental in all of this, which is the requirement in the Constitution found in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution that says that the President, quote, shall have power by and with the advice of the Senate to make treaties provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur. That's a pretty significant requirement. So let's address each of these arguments that we've heard in the last few minutes in turn. The fact that we've heard arguments about the fact that there has been significant bipartisan support for Ukraine aid, that doesn't negate this. I mean, first of all, providing material support, humanitarian or otherwise to Ukraine is not the same as a treaty. A treaty creates a lasting international obligation, one that is intended specifically to outlast, as my friend from Maryland noted is the objective here, supposed to transcend one administration to the next, so that it's not just a fleeting moment. It's an ongoing sovereign obligation. And for that very reason, Mr. President, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution requires that the Senate ratify treaties before they may take effect. Now, the President may propose them, the President may negotiate them, even sign them, but unless or until a treaty is presented to the Senate and ratified in executive session by the Senate via a two-thirds supermajority vote, takes 67 votes with 100 senators, then you don't have a treaty, and you don't have that lasting sovereign international obligation, one that transcends one administration to another. As far as the argument that there's been transparency, there's been outreach by the White House to senators and communication, that's great. It's the sort of thing that ought to happen. It is in no way sufficient to provide a substitute for or an end run around Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, requiring that treaties be presented to the Senate and ratified only with 67 votes in a 100-member chamber. So that doesn't do it. That can't take care of that here. Now, look, the point here is that there's nothing in what I'm suggesting that would necessarily close any doors in the future. What I'm trying to say here is that if we're going to do this, if we're going to close doors, as is the intention behind this agreement, close doors to future administrations, to future Congresses, to bind us to some kind of a lasting obligation as a sovereign nation to one or more other sovereign nations internationally, then we've got to follow the treaty process because that's what the Constitution requires. So, as to the idea that Ukraine is the front line of defending democracy, as I think was one of the arguments raised here, our own obligation to protect our own sovereign borders and our own people, while at the same time containing and deterring other potential threats to the United States, such as those presented by China. Those have to come first. Those are the front lines of our republic, our own border, our own national defense, our own national security, the safety, the freedom, the security of our own people. That is the front line that we are supposed to be focused on. That is literally our front line. And insofar as that's incompatible with our efforts on another continent, those things have to be taken into account. But there again, Mr. President, this is exactly the sort of thing that the Senate's supposed to consider, not just in the abstract, but in the context of a lasting, sovereign, international obligation in the context of treaty ratification proceedings. And that takes a two-thirds supermajority vote. Executive agreements do not, and constitutionally should not and cannot, supersede laws passed by Congress. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that a lasting, sovereign international obligation taken on by an executive agreement made by the President of the United States alone, whether with or without consultation to one or more members of Congress. There's nothing in there that says that that satisfies the constitutional obligation. Now, if the wording of Article 2, Section 2, or any other provision of the Constitution read otherwise, then we'd be in a different circumstance. But alas, we are not in that universe. And quite fortunately, we're not. It was with good reason that the founders put in there the two-thirds supermajority requirement. And we can't allow that simply to be bypassed here, not for light or casual purposes, not even for great purposes, no matter how great our purposes are, no matter how noble one's intentions might be in the administration, in the Senate, or otherwise, one can't get around this simple fact that what we're talking about here is, for all practical purposes, a treaty. And we're being asked to treat it as such. That requires 2/3. We don't have that here. So no matter how much bipartisan support, no matter how much flowery rhetoric, no matter how much good that can be done, no matter how evil Vladimir Putin is, that still doesn't change our constitutional realities. We've each been sworn into office under circumstances where, pursuant to another provision of the Constitution, we're required to take an oath to the Constitution itself. Our oath requires nothing less than that we honor this and that we not pretend that we can just circumvent all of this simply by calling something an executive agreement, no matter how justified by the circumstances we may want it to be. Look, at the end of the day, we have to come to grapple with the fact that we're $35 trillion in debt, that we face threats around the world, including and especially from China. China, which is gaining increasingly foothold in our own hemisphere, in country after country throughout Latin America. China is gaining a physical presence in addition to a more and more robust commercial arrangement, and in addition to China's investment in so-called dual-use technologies, which in many circumstances have military purposes behind them. It's one of many policy reasons why we've got to be focused on China. Insofar as we deplete our own resources in continuing to honor an obligation to another country in another hemisphere, we've got to take those things into account. It's one of many things that we've got to consider before taking on a treaty obligation. Make no mistake, this is a treaty obligation. Abraham Lincoln is quoted as having said, asked the question at first rhetorically, if you count the tail of a dog as a leg, how many legs does the dog have? People would apparently routinely, the uninitiated at least, respond by saying, well, 5 legs. And he'd say, no, it's still 4 legs. Just because you call the tail of a dog a leg doesn't make it so. Just because you call an executive agreement a treaty and ask people to treat it as if it were a treaty doesn't make it so. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.